Let's start with the session. Today, we are here to discuss the complexities and challenges and issues that come with climate finance, both in terms of mobilizing it and utilizing it and connecting the multiple dots and actors. We have a very interesting and experienced panel here. I won't introduce them right away because that's the job of the session moderator. So I would request all the panelists to please come and join at the dais. Siddharthan, Ms. Wang, Himanshu, Koyal, please. And I would invite Dr. Ritu Mathur, who is to moderate this session. Ritu is Director of the Green Growth and Resource Efficiency Division at TERI. She is a modeler, and her job is to scare all the people who are in the business of providing finance and mobilizing finance, because through her modeling studies, she tells upfront how many trillions are needed to deal with the climate change, and how many hundreds of billions of dollars are needed every year through 20 years or 50-year time frame. So I'll leave with Ritu for the further proceedings of this session. Ritu.
Anything to do with negotiations with regard to the text of what is required to move forward in terms of climate change mitigation or adaptation efforts have been put forward, and there has been little progress in this one element vis-a-vis if we compare to the kind of actions which we have seen in on the mitigation front, the kind of cooperative efforts we've seen in terms of technology transfer, etc. I think there's been much more said, much more done really with regard to all of those elements, but finance has always been a more sticky topic according to me. Again, at this juncture, the international efforts to tackle climate change have become major once again after the signing of the Paris Agreement. All countries put forward their INDCs. We sort of know that they are not going to get us to the levels which are needed in terms of moving forward from the climate science domain, and much more needs to be done. However, even the INDCs which have been put forward are mostly conditional, stating that if countries were to move forward to achieve what they have stated, depends a whole lot on the ability to get finance and how countries progress. All of these, I think, are questions which are extremely important, extremely critical to discuss at this juncture. So today we have a very elite panel here with, I think, expertise ranging across the domain that we need to address some of these key questions. And I think we are all looking forward to hearing a lot of solutions, a lot of ideation on where we think we can go forward with regard to climate finance for low carbon development in the coming days. So without much ado at this point in time, I will introduce the first speaker, and I would ask Himanshu to go first. Himanshu is Associate Vice President, Responsible Banking at Yes Bank. He has been involved with many projects aiming to bring transformations in a range of sectors such as water, highways, MSMEs, and of course the power sector, which again is very critical to most countries, as also India, and which requires one of the major transformations. So Himanshu.
So as we are discussing today, I think I should thank TERI and all the panelists here who are much more experienced than me. And I'm the starter for this session, so I might be a bit less educated than they are. So as we are speaking today, if you know that climate finance itself is not a very defined term. We keep on talking about climate finance, green finance, sustainable finance, keep on some factors of ESG in one, we keep environment, keep governance in one. So there is not a clear definition, but one thing is very clear about it. The thing is very clear that in all the development space, we have never heard about a hunger finance or a poverty finance. But we have heard about climate finance. And this actually brings in the private investment as well. Every time we talk about climate finance, we don't only talk about the public finance, we talk about private finance as well. The last report of approximations by CPI had around 60 to 62% of private sector investment in climate finance, which means that private sector is very much involved and very much geared up towards climate finance and things that that they can take up and take it to scale. So that is the good part of it. But the challenges still remains. The biggest challenge that Ritu herself said that the quantum required is really high. Indian NDCs itself put a number of $2.5 trillion, which is a very, very huge number. How it will be attained or achieved is therefore becomes a even larger task because even our the overall bank balance sheets will not be able to finance this much. So where will this come from? There has to be new innovative ways to do it. And there is very limited kind of, say, public finance which is available. The INDCs also talk about it. The NDCs, Indian NDCs also talk about that. We'll have to leverage private finance. We'll have to leverage international finance. Everything to make this possible, make Indian NDCs possible. So the first challenge was the quantum. The second was how do you use this limited quantum to achieve the larger scale. The third is how to bring more people and how to bring more, say, developers as well as financing institutions on board who adhere to these ESG parameters where the front runners have already taken a step and how to bring them to this scale so that our overall scale increases. And the fourth is something which is not very directly relevant, but one thing which is very good about climate or that we don't know the solutions yet. It's good because every new year you will find a new technology which is coming up, which is more promising than the existing one. And it is a challenge because we cannot commit all our money today. Whatever money that we have today, we cannot commit it. And therefore, we'll have to look at options where as the technologies evolve, as the solutions evolve, as the business models evolve, the money is directed to the right place, to the right, say, businessmen who will take it to a scale and who will make the impact. So for the first two, which is the quantum of the finance and how do we achieve from this smaller parts and aggregate it into one, we have been doing some things about it. The green bonds is one of the examples which Yes Bank has been a pioneer in India, and we have been able to raise more than 1,600 crores till date using 3 green bonds that we had issued. We have a portfolio of around 1,300 megawatt of renewable energy, which takes money from these 1,600 crores. So therefore, we have been able to mobilize some kind of finance, but again, this kind of financing, apart from the 6-7 other issuances that have happened in India, and the momentum is actually gaining, we are sure that the amount raised will be used effectively as well. Then coming to, say, how do you use, say, limited amount of finance which is available in the public domain, which can absorb the risks of new technologies for the most effective use? How can it be used to gather more finance from the private sector? How can it leverage that? So there are mechanisms like warehousing, where you can take the already existing and operational projects and free up the bank's capital. There is a mechanism of securitization where, and then credit enhancing that security. We have done that once for a private sector green bond, where we enhance the credit rating from BB to triple B to AA using a line from IIFCL. So this kind of mechanisms are actually going to use this public sector as just as a leverage to mobilize more capital in the private sector and making things happen. Technologies, as I told you, technologies will be providing both from sourcing of this capital. So a crowdsourcing which is being used across now as for small projects can also be used for large projects and large adaptation projects as well. There has been some successes in the area, and using technology to source financing is one thing that we can look forward to. The other thing that can be looked at is the mobile platforms. And it becomes very important to provide financial access, especially in terms of adaptation that we think about. If a person has access to finance and able to do transactions at the micro level through his mobile or through without having much of an expense at his side, these transactions will actually help in adaptation projects where you will be able to provide better education, you will be able to provide for better even disaster management in case you, it can be helped through these mechanisms. Yes Bank has been working with the National Payment Corporation of India to develop a new payment app which is more flexible than the current apps. It uses your Aadhaar-linked bank account directly. It does not create a separate wallet. So, your account holds your money, and at the same time the payments are made much more flexible. So these kind of innovations will be used to providing access as well as in adaptation. As far as the third challenge of how to bring in more people to onboard or more banks on board, it is very important for them for the capacity to have the capacity building of both the developers or the people who are creating these projects, and as well as the bankers. Bankers, especially for new technologies, have been reluctant to adopt, or in case of ESG, it is not very conducive to them because it's new. Just because it's new and they don't know how is it going to entail, how will the client react to me, is something that prevents these bankers from adopting ESG principles in their mainstream debt. We have been doing it, and we have been incorporating these in our mainstream debts. And to do the capacity building, we have been engaging with IBA, and we did contribute our bit in the development of the National Voluntary Guidelines on Responsible Financing. We have been doing some workshops as well at Yes Bank for the financiers as well as for the industry to make them aware of ESG risks and how ESG risks can be mitigated and how more people can be brought in the overall ambit of climate finance / sustainable finance, which it is. So, and coming to the last point, that how do we cater to new technologies, new ways of finance, and how do we accept more new technologies which provide solution and not commit to whatever is available today. Renewable energy is a very good example where 5 years ago everybody was very reluctant, and now today people are very receptive, very easy to go and understand about renewable energy risks. And it was done through a series of say interventions. There was accelerated depreciation, there was some incentives, and then there was a target. So everything went in a loop, and now renewable energy is a very easy to know term across the financing sector as well as in developers, and there is a good supply as well as demand for it. So similar kind of interventions for each, say if I look at water, if I look at energy efficiency is another sector where the partial risk guarantees have been issued both by BEE and by SIDBI for small ESCOs to take loans, because these energy efficiency loans generally were not very conducive to the bankers, because they did not have a backing. They did not have a collateral backing, and ESCO's balance sheet will not be able to have such good credit rating to get such good finance. So therefore, these small guarantees will help actually mobilize finance to energy efficiency as well. So these new technologies and new methods of business will have to keep our finances as well aligned that, okay, renewable energy is today the best option available, but tomorrow there can be other best options. So one thing is to expand the current basket. What we can do is blend finance. Blending is something that is very important in terms how do you assign the risks to the real people or real investments. So a pure catastrophic risk can only be assigned to a pure grant fund. It cannot be assigned to anything else, because that risk cannot be mitigated anywhere else. But wherever there are other risks can be mitigated by different kind of finances, like low-cost finance or pure debt or pure equity, or different kind of blends which are available. And if they are assigned directly to these risks, is something that will create a real blend of finance. The other option that I'm really talking about is keeping our options open for new technologies to be incorporated. So if I'm saying that there is something that is coming up down the line which is based on nanotechnology and which produces much better output than LEDs which we are using, which we are pushing right now. 2 years down the line, if nanotechnology comes and it is even more efficient than that, we have already committed all our bulbs to LED. So how do we keep that options open, and when do we cut is something, it's actually a thought. It's not something that we can really do right now, but it's a thought that has to be put in conferences like these so that it can be churned better and be developed later on. So these are my inputs. I know all my fellow panelists will be giving much more insights into climate finance. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Himanshu. That was extremely useful. And I think the key point I took from there was that we are living in a dynamic world. Technologies are going to evolve. Today we see renewables, but tomorrow we may see another kind of renewables or new kind of technologies. So we need a constant change, a constant learning, a constant innovation in how we are doing things and what we are doing. Excellent. So could I request now, Ms. Wang?
Do we take questions now or later?
Maybe we'll get to the panel together. Ms. Wang. So let me just introduce Ms. Wang. She's coordinator of Cities and Climate Change of the World Bank. She leads the World Bank's global platform for sustainable cities and the work on the design of the International Energy Efficiency Facility to promote green bonds. She was a team leader for the World Bank's Partnership for Market Readiness, a global program for supporting countries to prepare and implement carbon pricing schemes such as emissions trading and carbon tax. She's played a critical role in helping China develop national carbon market and was part of the core team that set up the largest carbon fund in the world in 2007. So I think we're going to learn a lot from her. She has extremely great amount of knowledge in this field, and we are looking forward to hear from you.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, and good afternoon for everybody, and thank you for staying with us. I know it's late. I hope that you find this session in the end useful. And at the very beginning of the session, Manish mentioned that this session may be mysterious, people trying to find a way to come. Mysterious, actually that struck me. It's true, this climate financing, green finance is somehow mysterious in the way that, on the one hand, for example, the World Bank, we love to say, no, we are not talking about millions, we are talking about billions, how to mobilize billions. But on the other hand, we also hear, look, where to find money. And then we also say that on the one hand, it's true, the money is sitting at the capital market. We are talking about billions of dollars. But on the other hand, why they're sitting there, why they're not investing? you cannot really find good investable projects. And once you find some good investable project with good returns, everybody jump. So they really, I think one of the major challenge or mysteries that how to bridge that gaps. And that's continued to be, I don't think that we will be able to immediately provide solutions, but perhaps just use this opportunity to share some of the observations and say going forward what can be done to bridge that gap. It would take some time. So maybe for this session, I like also use the green bonds. Currently, we are also working maybe as a way to demonstrate that how just green bonds. Now we all have heard of green bonds. What actually role of green bonds? Is there any that green bond can bridge that gap? Just a few slides to give you a little bit information about what. So the overall green bond market. One thing again, we like to say that green bond, in fact, started just a few years ago. It started with the European Investment Bank and then World Bank. But very soon, I have a slide. It's just that. But very soon, and you see the private sector and the corporates actually have taken up. Yes Bank, together with the IFC, actually did issue the first, if not the first green bond, but it's the first of its kind as offshore green bond, masala bonds. So just say that how the development bank, you start with that. We are very happy to see if you look at the graphic at how the World Bank's proportion in terms of the green bond market share is much, much less and has been taken over by the corporate, by the commercial banks. And I give you another example. China, for a long, long time, China was not involved in the green bonds at all, but just started with this, they were hosting G20, and just last year and to this year, quickly, their market share globally has already taken up almost 40% of global market share. So they came with a full swing. And so we are talking about, they started last year, and now I think it's even going. By the end of this year, as their central bank projected that it would probably be more than 60%, the green bond will be issued by Chinese commercial banks. But again, just like one of the we see those big numbers, and it's growing fast. But one important question also to ask is that how the green bonds actually make a difference, and how green is really green. So if you look at if you look at the what normally commercial banks, including the World Bank, what we have done is really that issue the green bonds and refinance the projects, and majority of capital go to the renewable energy, and you have also some energy efficiency, some agriculture. So it's ring-fence all those investment portfolio. And have they, so the next question people always ask, when you start with your new client that they want to issue green bond, the question is that anybody would be willing to pay green premium, which means that whether they could, your coupon rate, right, could be lower than the normal, that's green. And the question is that not really, nobody actually really willing to pay, even it's green because it's associated with some particular types of projects. So we still facing this dilemma that where when you come down with difficult, challenging green projects where difficult to find finance, you cannot find money because they're not profitable. And I give you examples. Last year I was at the Global Infrastructure Summit. That was happened in Singapore. That happened just before Paris meeting, climate conference meeting. I was struck by the fact it was a whole day meeting with many investors, public and private investors. There was no one word throughout the entire display. Nobody ever mentioned green, climate change, or sustainability. What everybody worries that if we talk about infrastructure investment, in the end, the private sector is not really interested. Why? Because the infrastructure investment is long-term, and the return is very risky, and the return, is minimum. So the reaction for most private sector is that, look, the capital is not patient. they want to invest, they want to get a high return and leave. That's the normal private sector, and does. So, by issuing green bonds or you have the green financing has not really bridged that gap. And just that whole day debate with so many private sector, public sectors, everybody really talk about infrastructure investment. People really talk about how you can find a way that make infrastructure investment attractive, and that attractive largely come from return. So that's a way that I will not also say that we also have a green climate fund, and it has not functioned in the way that we would like to see. It's yet, put it this way, it's yet to play a role that would really leverage private capital. So going forward, some of the, I think that by colleagues from the Yes Bank, you have listed a number of the solutions, approaches. In fact, we are also thinking about this, basically similar ways. And from my own experience, it's not that you get subsidized money, but there's always the issue that once the subsidized money finish, what will be the next? Whether the market really has that appetite, and the private sector, they have to make a profit. They have to make a certain amount of profit. Otherwise, it's not called private sector. So, and where that you can really provide incentive to invest in the long-term sustainability. Here, I will not think solutions, but really just based on some experience, what I have done. I feel that I live in two worlds, the transaction part as well as the public sector. Sometimes, just like the World Bank, we are the banking, but we are also development institution, and sometimes struggle between the two, whether we are all banking or we are more development. So, number of the ways for is really for discussion. One is that the role of government on the policy intervention. For example, renewable, the feed-in tariff is actually has played a quite important role to get the investment into the renewable energy. So that's a good, a typical policy intervention that can be done through the public sector. And secondly, I was talking about pricing. Like I personally have worked on carbon pricing quite extensively. Carbon pricing is not a silver bullet. It's not that you will have carbon price and everything be resolved. But it's also true, if you don't put appropriate price on carbon, the investment would go to the cheaper solutions. But if there's appropriate level of carbon pricing, and that would also leverage the investment into green. That's an economic instrument to leverage investment, and their decision, the investment committee would do their calculation. If you have a carbon pricing, say 20, 30 US dollars, compared with the currently very low price in the EU market. And then when they do the calculation to the return, the investment decision will be quite different once the carbon pricing reaches certain level. So that's one. And the third part, I also, as your Yes Bank colleagues mentioned, that how we define the way, some approaches, some mechanisms, small or big, and can actually leverage. You mentioned the CITB's risk-sharing guarantee, and I do think that going forward, some type of risk-sharing guarantee can be very, very useful. If we look at a lot of investment gaps, really eventually the private sector who would absorb that risk, and how the public sector, public governments, and also all those green climate funds and other donor funds, how you can actually do have a risk-sharing guarantee mechanism to absorb some of the risk as a way to leverage investment. So that's number of the solutions, number of the thinkings. For the World Bank, I think I have the few slides. We are currently on the energy efficiency, we are also looking at the opportunities. How also energy efficiency is one of the major pillars for for the world to move towards reaching 2 degrees, right? So energy is a major, and then financing is a major gap. Then how we find a way to do it. So we are also thinking about whether there's energy efficiency financing facility can do some role, as we have described, can be risk sharing, and can also by structuring provide some guarantee. And here I like to use the example, a company that you all know quite well. It's the leading company, and EESL, Energy Efficiency Service Limited. I think the fact that it's a public sector, but they have developed business model that have a lot of traction for private investment. Just a few weeks ago, they issued corporate bonds and will be able to mobilize the capital by themselves through the capital market. I think that's a great model, that how public sector, if you have a good business model, that will be able to mobilize capital investment from private sector. So I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that was very interesting. Again, I think we heard clearly about the big difference between the trillions that we need and the billions that they are, what the GCF needs to move towards, but still has a big, what we see as a big gap, and the need for being innovative and trying to maybe scale up what we are seeing people like EESL having tried in India, but I see the scope for, again, gearing up and getting into larger innovations on several fronts. May I move on right now to the next speaker, Mr. Siddharth Balasubramaniam. Siddharth is the first country representative of the Global Green Growth Institute, which is a membership-based intergovernmental organization headquartered in Seoul, Korea. He is responsible for developing and implementing the GGI strategies and programs in India, engaging with governments, program design and management, and day-to-day administration of the Indian program. Before this, Siddharthan was in Washington as director for the Major Economies Initiative under the Climate Change and Energy Program with the World Resources Institute, and he has held several roles in WWF, etc. earlier. So Siddharthan comes with a lot of knowledge in this arena, and can I call on him to share his experience?
Knowledge for sure, not money. So, and if you're talking about money, by the way. So thank you, Ritu. Greetings to co-panelists and the audience. Two things struck me. One, Manish, when the room was empty, even now, I would say it's not full yet, you said, the room is in a mysterious place, right? People have to find a way. But money, people chase money, right? People chase money. The smart people find a way to get the money. So I think all of you here, I would consider you really smart. You know where exactly the money is. So thanks for coming and spending some time with us. The second thing that struck me was, Ritu, when you're opening remark, you asked where is the money. What we're trying to hear said is between the bank and the Yes Bank, we are still at least talking billions. The question is, how do we get even the existing money? So there is another question we are talking about, not only where is the money and how to exist the existing money. So that's the two things that struck me in terms of what I heard so far. The topic I have is very interesting one, developing bankable green projects. Do not assume I'm a banker. Do not assume I've done a lot of banking except for going to ATM withdrawing money like all of you do. You're talking about a complete different language. And I was a bit scared when Himanshu said, the people in the dais are more experienced than on others. Because it is a different language ultimately we have to learn. And I have no excuse to say, I'm not a banker, co-banker, I don't know investment, I cannot talk about climate change. Because if you believe in the climate change, we need to see the action need to happen quickly and sooner. We better learn the language of bankable projects. That's what I'm trying to learn, like many of you. So, that's an important one, because that distinction of a banker and non-banker will have to vanish very soon if you were to collectively address the climate change. And that's starting point for me. And also I just want to, before getting into the presentation, which I'll run pretty quickly, is, the consensus when we talk about climate finance as a whole, what we talked about green, we are a Global Green Growth Institute, I talk about green, Shuman talked about the same. If you notice a portfolio of Yes Bank, it is about financing renewable energy. So we are talking about from the supply side how to make things green so that the finance flow become green. And if you assume that, rather than financing a clean coal technology, etc., if you assume that two global trend we have to recognize, and I think I'm very happy about it. One, the accelerated investment in clean energy is going up, which is, I think, in terms of capacity as well, but certainly it is going up in the last few years. It's hitting a record level. We must recognize it. It's a very good sign. But it may not be sufficient. If you add the SDGs under the INDC, it may not be sufficient. So we have to recognize both. It is increasing, hitting a record level. At the same time, it is not going to be sufficient we have achieved. The second global trend we have to really observe and appreciate, which I hope is reversible, is how the decoupling happened between the renewable energy investment or the cost of renewable energy per unit, whatever it is, and the falling crude oil prices. So it is not the last year, 2015 was the lowest in terms of crude oil prices. Doesn't mean that the renewable energy investment gone down. It has actually gone up. So I'm glad that decoupling has happened, but I think I believe, and I would like to believe it is a reversible trend, and I want to recognize that as well. With those kind of broader opening thing, I just want to run 2 slides in terms of who we are. It is a Global Green Growth Institute. There are slides at the backside, but essentially we are a intergovernmental, something akin to IEA, IRENA, set up by a multi-government, run by a civil government. That's where we are. We are pretty young. In 2012 began the intergovernmental, working around 22 countries. There are 26 member countries run by a council and assembly in a classic intergovernmental structure and governance. In India, we have been here in 2013. We worked the subnational level, but starting 2016, we made a shift in terms of moving from subnational to national level, focusing on INDC. The 2 big streams are, as you see, INDC implementation, how we support, and how we help. Again, a big thing on knowledge sharing we would emphasize going forward. And these 2, specifically what you see in highlight portion, are how the modalities are. We'll begin our journey in terms of supporting INDC implementation in India. Preparing a project program for Green Climate Fund, and also a specific mechanism which I'll talk in slightly bit more detail on supporting this renewable energy based INDC target for India. Before that, INDC, when I say INDC implementation, it is not about India's strategy, it is a global strategy for GGGI. We have a strategic plan for 2015-2020, which gives INDC as a primary focus of driving green growth, because that becomes a huge, climate impact is going to impact what we have done so far across the sectors. Taking that into account, and INDC is a global focus. We did a bit of a thorough review of around 20 countries INDCs where we are working. We are member countries, GGA member countries. These are some key insights. It's quite stark, actually. If you see it, there are numbers are important but in terms of countries, among the member countries, there are only 20% have the quantified sector targets. But when you say, even though it is a good point, there is not only they have a overarching target within the sector, they have even sub-sectoral targets and how much they will remove, with a deadline. Including, I can cite Indonesia, even when they had the Copenhagen Pledge, they have a sectoral target, then they have a provincial target sector-wise. They have one category like that. The second category is about, they have INDC, but there is no numbers anywhere, including at the country level. There is no BA deviation or emission cap or relative emission intensity, etc. No number at all. Then you have a 10% which you have mentioned about investment. They're linking the INDC targets quantified versus the cost. They do have some, 10% of them. But the most striking thing is 75% do not have any cost related to it. That's a problem area. Because if finance were to be a key driver for INDC implementation, those 75% within the GGA countries, maybe much more when you go globally, do not link what they need to do to the investment required. That's a bit stark fact. Then how do you went about, what is a starting point when we get into INDCs? There are 4 steps, but I don't think it's a blueprint for anyone, but that is how we went about. Look into the INDC as the country level pledge or action. Then we also looked into what other related policy framework exists. In India, for example, the National Climate Change Action Plan, you have state action plan. Similarly, every country has other climate change framework. So we looked at where these two are linked. Now SDG is another dimension as countries developing a framework. That's one part, the first part. The second one is looking at contextualizing INDCs. You have a numbers now. These are the existing policies, how they speak to each other. Is it way off? Who would play the major role? It is government driven or private sector driven or something else, internationally supported, etc. That's the second level of analysis we've done. And the third one is, okay, assuming these countries have accepted the INDC targets, what they need to be in place in terms of policy, program, investment framework to achieve the INDCs. That's a third level of analysis. And all lead to what we are trying to do in several countries, at least 10 countries for now. Based on the analysis, can we have some pipeline? When I say pipeline, it may be one project, it may be two projects, but we will, doing the analysis, we will come to specific project, we will design, walk through in terms of technical support, and lead to money. That's what we have done. You see the left arrow, which is essentially knowledge sharing, which is again, as I said, each process is going to be a learning for GGGI and all the countries, including GCF, West Bank, whoever does it, you're going to be a knowledge sharing component across as we do, and that will be occurring across. The point you clearly raised, and we also echo that. There is a two-way theory exists. The project developers say there is no money, irrespective of what sort of money, there's no money. Then banks and investors say we do have money, we don't have the kind of project we would like to invest. So the truth lies somewhere in between, but that is a reality at which we recognize what Shuman exactly said. Now, when I say bankable, what makes a project bankable? And I want to read out, looking at a perspective of a cluster of investors who would be a development banker, or a commercial banker, Yes Bank and others, there are set criteria. If you look at this left side of the bullets, predominantly these are economic characteristics in terms of credit risk, what is the rate of return, what should be the legal structure, etc., etc. That's a classical way of looking at investment. Now take GCF as an example where that is a target for us. The criteria are quite different. But that doesn't exclude the left side also. When you look at the GCF, there are 6 investment criteria, right? If I'm right, there are 6 investment criteria, which is listed out, which are quite significant. Each one, if you unpack, for example, impact potential, it is essentially you're talking about climate mitigation and adaptation, preferably quantified. Then paradigm potential is about how far you scale up. How far this is additional in terms of requiring GCF investment, the need of the country, then how it aligns with the country policy planning framework. So if you look at each criteria for GCF, which goes beyond what you see in the left side, that doesn't mean that when you go to GCF project, you completely exclude. In fact, the left side also becomes subset of the right side. So it is a bit of a complex way to access fund. So there is one demand, how to make it simplified process and procedures for GCF and other climate finance instruments so that it becomes easier for government, other project developers to access finance. That's something we are into in terms of technical support. Now, since we are talking about climate change, we are talking climate finance, how far quantification of the climate benefit will help the government and the project developers. I think pretty no-brainer there. Because the moment you quantify in terms of both mitigation and adaptation, your diversification of funding sources begin expansion. In terms of developing one project which is well quantified, well analyzed climate benefits, you can access multiple sources of funding, including investment bankers like Yes Bank and others, the investment institution like a pension fund, sovereign wealth fund, as well as development banks like World Bank, ADB, and Green Climate Fund. That's one. However, the point Shuman also raised about the current carbon pricing, the carbon market, where it is. There was a time when CDM was at the peak, we had to monetize the GHG benefit. And there was a market exist, which it doesn't now. But I think my hope and probably a deliberate effort should happen, this morning we heard is some sort of carbon signal, a market signal should emerge. In that case, monetizing the carbon benefit will become an additional one. Right now, that may not be. For investor, it is only a kind of bonus. That's the, that we have to recognize it. But however, there are set of investors now, including particularly institutional investors, now stopping investment in fossil fuel and going for green. They're looking for a green project. I think that is going to be a kind of a greenfield area where climate project will be very beneficial. We are going to do that. And that's where attractive proposal in an area for investment for the green project we are thinking of. Now contextualizing it, now that's the kind of general theory of what is a bankability, etc. In India, coming back to India, there's something we are just working on. We have INDC, India, I don't have to repeat the three pillars. One is about emission intensity, another one is about the 40% of the capacity by 2030 to be from the non-fossil fuel. The third one is from the land use in terms of additional carbon sink. We cannot address to begin with, since we are a technical support agency having very limited resources support. We looked at what we can add value into, because our strategy is also pretty clear in terms of we focus on 4 sectors: energy, water, land use, and green cities. So within that, if there has to be a match with where we work, where we help with the INDC implementation in terms of where we add value. In that, we picked up the renewable energy based INDC in India. Within that, since we have a strong focus on leveraging finance, we want to focus on the financing aspect of the renewable energy INDC. So that's the starting point of what you see in the slide. There's a big question come to us, is when you go for a project, like we CDM did, what we think was, can we open up a sector by this opportunity? When you say sector, it could be health, education, but we are defining sector in a different way. Within the INDC, you have 3 types of targets, as you know. If you see the renewable energy addition, 175. One is the solar, the wind, the biomass in terms of technology base. Other 2 are about the solar rooftop, which is 40 gigawatt within the 100 gigawatt solar rooftop. Pretty challenging. The other one is about 2 gigawatts of off-grid solar, which is even more challenging. We picked up that off-grid. That's a sector which is a lot talked about, which meets the national goals in terms of electricity for all, energy access, but full of challenges. That's what picked up in terms of how to convert this or open up the off-grid sector, linking to INDC, linking to climate finance. That's what we picked up. And you see the numbers in terms of the various types of energy. I don't want to give details, but the challenges of off-grid are quite stark. One is about, as Himanshu rightly said, some of the thing is, they are not bankable because of several reasons. One, they do not have the balance sheet which other bankers would like to say, which would essentially come running a profitable for few business. We have a what credit history to reflect. That's a missing. Second one, off-grid sector is about the ticket size is pretty small. We are not talking about a multi-billion. We are talking about 300,000. Average size is 150,000. Right now talking about 200,000 max dollars, of course. Small ticket size, it is not attractive to the large commercial banks. The third one is obviously, they starve of fund to run 2 things. One, the upfront capital cost. Second one, to run the business in terms of operation. Third one, expansion. So there is a clear dearth. And fourth one, we believe the perceived risk of off-grid, it is actually much higher than the actual risk. If you go into the detail, and that is the reason that the perception is wrong, then you don't get the money. That's what the off-grid sector suffers. And we want to address those challenges head on by developing innovative financial product. We call this a debt fund, but could be called anything else. But essentially targeting the sector in the graph, you see the off-grid enterprises, there are various stages you can analytically framework, which is the seed stage, which is essentially where the equity, the angel investors, or the guy who really now impact investors also jump in and kind of test out ideas. We are not there exactly. We want to look into the stage where companies have established, they run the business for 2-3 years, they figured out what the field is, they invested, they have some history, credit history, but struggle to kind of expand. And that's a space we want to focusing in devising a debt instrument where we can address those risks I talked about. And one is about all the financial terms. When we get into this, another challenge we are tackling, I think we are doing good work, is you're building up a partnership to try and take this. Particularly when we want to target as a green climate fund, which is a mechanism under the UNFCCC essentially run by the government. A mechanism under the UNFCCC essentially means there is a larger bureaucracy involved to handle this. In case of India, if you want to convert this idea into a proposal, what we need is we have to work with minimum 4 government entities. One, the accredited entity, in this case of India, where you have NABARD as the only one, which may go up after the October board meeting. They have to be on board. They are the channel for it. The second one is the Ministry of Environment Forest, which is a nodal agency, or the national designated entity, like the CDM days. They have to give several approval, including how they are sustainable, linked to national policy, as well as no objection certificate. The third one for this kind of thing is about a host, who will host a fund. NABARD maybe, but MOEF cannot. We need a real investor who hosts a fund, run the whole thing. We need a third one. It could be anybody. Fourth one is institution like us, Global Green Growth Institute, or several institutions who convert the idea, facilitate structuring the project. It is a huge capacity building initiative. Invest money. We actually invest fund to do some of the feasibility reports, which is essentially important for Green Climate Fund. So the whole work we are doing, not only converting the idea into a project, but essentially massive engagement building partnership to make this happen. So that's where we are at this point of time. We are pretty hopeful. It is a learning phase for us. But I think getting the signal from the government, particularly with the MNRE, we work pretty closely with them. We will be very hopeful that the idea will become a project we will be able to access from the Green Climate Fund. Those are my thoughts. But as you said, I'm learning, but I'm very keen to learn. I'm a quick learner as well. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Wonderful, Siddharth. And I think we've heard a deluge of points from Siddharthan, and all of them extremely important. I think the key points I picked up there were we need to speak a common language. There needs to be an understanding between the bankers and the people who don't speak the bankers' language. There are different characteristics in the kind of things which are required for climate or infrastructure kind of financing, and again, this needs greater clarity. Perception changes are required, and in terms of engagement and partnership building, again, a lot needs to be done. Stakeholders need to come together. I think a host of points out there, but let's move to our last speaker and then come back to the panelists again. So let me introduce our last speaker, Koyal. So Mr. Koyal Mandal is currently working as Senior Advisor on Climate Change at GIZ. He supports the implementation of various bilateral cooperation projects on climate mitigation and climate finance in close cooperation with the German and Indian governments. Mr. Mandal has extensive national and international experience in the areas of climate policy, renewable energy, and natural resource management. He has a background in economics and public policy, and we are waiting to hear from you, Mandal.
Thank you, Ritu. So I'm going to talk about market-based models for mobilizing climate finance. And if I heard the speakers before me, I think this is one common theme that we are all talking about: private sector participation, mobilizing more funds from capital markets. Now the question is, how do we do that, right? And of course, I think Himanshu laid out the different elements of accessing and mobilizing climate funds pretty well. And I'm just going to pick up one of those points, and I think my entire talk is around that, which is how do you bring different kinds of partners to build a collaborative model? Because if you look at the entire climate finance space, and Siddharth also mentioned this, there are truly different kinds of partners. And the idea is to create shared value by bringing together these different kinds of partners. And in doing that, I think the very first thing is understanding risk. Where do all these risks lie? Can you absorb those risks? Are you able to transfer those risks to different people who are capable of absorbing them? And then you design incentives accordingly. So what I'm going to talk about are three sort of case studies or models where GIZ has concrete experience. And these three case studies are in different sectors, different kinds of models, some in the planning stage, some in the implementation stage. And the idea is sort of what do we learn from there, and how do we then take these kind of examples into sort of a space where we clearly need more funds, and also we clearly need to bring different kinds of partners together. So the first example I'm going to talk about is our program on umbrella program for natural resource management. So this is a unique model for us. We've been working on this since 2008. And this is unique in the sense, I think this is one of the first examples of a loan product in the natural resource management sector. Most of the institutions that you will see in the natural resource management sector in the livelihood space, primarily grant-based models. And wherever there are loan-based models, most of these beneficiaries do not have access to commercial funding institutions, and therefore they take credit at relatively higher interest rate from different informal sources of lending. So this was an experiment where we brought together different kinds of partners to see if a loan-based model works in the natural resource management sector. And the other interesting part was it was a credit plus approach. So it wasn't just the loan, and this is oftentimes the case. I mean, we talk about finance so much, but we forget that there are so many other elements that need to come together for finance to work. And this is where exactly GIZ sort of came in the training and capacity building part of the different partners. And I'll come back to the impact later. But just a simple model of how this works. The money in this case, and again, just clarifying one point that Himanshu raised, the definition of climate finance. This is not climate finance. What I will be talking about primarily is finance for climate change. So the money might come from different sources. This in this case, this was ODA, but essentially it's going towards a climate objective. So KfW gave money through a financial cooperation project with the government of India. NABARD was the first recipient of the money, and this was part grant and part loan. And then the way the money is disbursed is NABARD has these channel partners. Channel partners could be NGOs, could be regional rural banks, commercial banks, and they then sort of give out loans, part loan, part grant, to integrated livelihood-based projects, primarily in the rural sector. And these can be in different areas. You know, it could be sustainable farming, it could be integrated fisheries management. And the last sort of element there is GIZ. We provide technical support to a lot of these different players. Because like I said, I mean, there are different kinds of support you can imagine. I mean, all of us work in this space, so we know the nature of technical support that's required in making a loan-based product work successfully. So I think we've had, what, kind of 8 years of experience now. And so far it's been over 500 crore rupees in loans and more than 300 projects. We're across 21 states in India and trying to sort of reach out to the existing northeastern region, which we don't have a portfolio now, but that's where we're trying to reach out to. So this is sort of one clear model where we try to bring different players together and sort of try to move the conversation away from a sort of grant-based model to a loan-based model and trying to find out what parameters work, what doesn't work. Very quickly, of course, I already mentioned these, the sort of USPs of this project. It's a shift from grant to loan. It's a credit plus approach, so not just the finance part, but various other supporting elements. It's an integrated model. So we are no longer talking about, for example, one livelihood-based asset, for example, a livestock. If we are lending for livestock, it has to be revenue from the livestock, then a biogas plant that's connected to that, an organic farming practice that's connected to that. So this kind of integrated model is what we're talking about, and that's what you're promoting through this. And it's almost the principle of risk diversification. When you have a basket of sort of income-generating activities that are combined in one project, I think your risk is also diversified. And last but not the least, ensuring sustainability of natural resources. That's where the climate angle, the natural resource management angle comes. So I guess very quickly, if you go back to what I showed, what we have now, and this is sort of what I really want to talk about today, is understanding so far, because none of these models are set in stone. This is not the only model that will work, but what do we understand from these models? So a different program within GIZ runs this. I don't see anyone here in the room, but when I spoke to them, they're at this point where you can replace a KfW by Yes Bank, for example, and NABARD by someone else. So we have sort of, by learning and by doing, figured out the steps. We have reduced sort of the amount of time required to identify new projects, formulate new projects, and slowly we can have even commercial capital come into this kind of a model.
And how long would it take to are in many to achieve the results?
Well, it's not a case study, it's a running program. The first phase was 2008 to 2012. This is the second phase of the project, 2012 and running. Overall, like I said, 500 crore rupees has so far been loaned out to around 300 projects in different sectors, different states. Yeah. The second example that I'm going to talk about is an example in the waste management sector. It's part of a bilateral cooperation project on NAMAs, National Appropriate Mitigation Action, between the government of Germany, the Environment Department, Ministry, and the MOEFCC in India. I'm not going to talk about the project because I primarily want to talk about the financing structure that sort of we came up with. And again, if you look here, the proposal that we are developing for the NAMA facility, the NAMA support project, it's based on the concept of co-processing of RDF in the cement sector. Now, if you look at sort of the main bottleneck, where is the business model, where is the risk in this entire model, right? Because you have cement plants now, and there are a few cement plants that are already using RDF as a sort of raw material in their production process. So what is the real problem in the business model? If you look at the cement plants, they find it more cost effective to use fossil fuels, coal for example, instead of municipal solid waste. Why? A, the transportation cost. Even if you get very well quality, good quality RDF, the cost of transportation from the plant to the cement plant is quite high for them right now. And second, to find good quality, good sort of usable quality of RDF that can be directly, without any tinkering, without any pre-processing, be used in the cement plant. So that's where, that's the sort of crux of the intervention in this project. With international climate funding, we are trying to design an output-based financing scheme that will incentivize the waste processors. So A, it would provide them output-based incentive for producing good quality RDF. And B, once we sort of implement this for, say, the next 5 years, we will understand sort of the things that need to be institutionalized. So, for example, if future credit needs to come from the municipalities, the ULBs, or if there are rules and regulations, procedures that need to be changed in the waste management rules. So those are the kind of understanding that we will have, and then we can sort of institutionalize them in a formal way. Just to clarify, this is something we're designing right now as a project. But again, very quickly, the role sort of that we're trying to play, if you see, there are different actors in the entire diagram, right? It's not just these two cement plants and the waste processor. You have to find out ULBs who are interested, who have some kind of sort of this mechanism going on, who have cement plants in their territories, who have waste processes already, and then the gap funding can play a role. Of course, at the central level, we are working with the ministries, MOEFCC and MOUD, to get sort of buy-in from ULBs, and then also sort of talk to the private sector players in their jurisdiction. So again, identifying sort of what I started with, identifying the risk and incentives for each of the players, trying to bring them together to create shared value. Last example, very quickly, this is again something we are experimenting with. You may all know about the new CSR rule that requires all companies of a certain size to spend 2% of their annual profit on a list of activities. And although not explicitly, implicitly climate change is one of those activities. So companies, if they are willing to, they can invest a part of their 2% profit in climate change activities. So the idea we came up with is, of course, companies on their own are doing quite a bit. But of course, these are fragmented projects. Yes Bank, for example, would do something in sort of wherever their experience is, or where it makes sense for them to leverage community benefits. For example, someone else will do it in their jurisdiction, so on and so forth. Now, what is happening in this whole process is you're not being able to leverage the potential of CSR funds. You're funding small projects, but the idea of sort of programmatic and transformational change, what Siddharthan was talking about, right? And it is a clear sort of potential that's there. If you try to pull together CSR funds from at least a few of these companies and try and invest them in larger programmatic ideas, I think sort of the impact is much higher. So the selling point for us with this, what we are calling the India Climate Responsibility Facility, is basically leveraging CSR funds from different companies. The selling point is, A, you can fund programs that otherwise as a single company you can't, therefore your impact is much higher. B, investing in this facility as opposed to doing it on your own reduces your administration cost. And C, you're part of a larger government agenda. I mean, INDC is something that you spoke about quite a bit. So directly by creating such a fund, investing in such a fund, you're becoming part of India's larger climate change agenda. So this was the sort of logic or underlying assumption with which we created this. We have moved quite a bit in the process. We now have around 12 corporate members as our board members. Yes Bank sort of is also on board with this. So right now we are at the stage where we're trying to find out a good, effective agency that can host this platform. They are the ones who will sort of have the mitigation window and the adaptation window within this ICRF and invest the money and design the program. And of course, everything else that comes with. And finally, it's not just about CSR funds. Once you have a fund like that, you can leverage all these other sources as well. So if you say that we have a pot of money that's worth whatever X amount, can we get matching funds for this to invest in so and so project? So that's where the leveraging part comes as well. So I guess in a nutshell, this is what I want to talk about. 3 different examples, 3 different sectors, different kinds of players. How do you bring them together for a common purpose, for a shared value, and what do you learn out of the process? So I guess the learning part, we'll leave it in the panel discussion if there are questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Koel. That's excellent. I think we've had a very rich session with all the speakers here, getting a number of perspectives and great examples. I think the key things which got voiced were about bridging the billion-trillion gap, how to leverage finance and to increase the basket of what we are seeing on the table, the need for innovation and the need to be dynamic in terms of being able to move forward, understanding the definitions, what works, what doesn't work, etc., ways to eliminate risk perceptions, several examples of what has been done and tried but needing to go forward as well, and of looking at the numerous players who come into the whole exercise of being able to bring synergies and move forward in looking at climate finance. So I'm not going to stand between you in terms of the questions. I know all of you are raring to ask the speakers, and we'll open up the floor for questions, maybe for, I think we can take 15-20 minutes of questions. So we'll take it in 2 rounds. I'll collect a few questions and then ask the panelists to respond, and then we'll do 1 more round. So questions.
Good evening. My name is Jay. I work with Adelphi. I don't have a finance background, and this question is for the World Bank representative on the dais. So you lend to countries like African countries, which are very...
We are hoping that maybe for some smart cities where there's an interest, we can provide targeted training. The objective is that if we can help, if not all of them, a few municipal governments can get to the stage where they can get investment grade and issue the bonds from the capital market. Yeah.
So our municipalities, I think most of them run on negative balances. They cannot charge higher for their water services or for their electric, wherever they have whatever services that they give. They cannot charge higher because they are doing public good, and at the same time they cannot recover their costs. And therefore, even if you were to invest, it will never be an investment. So therefore, municipalities are the good case of Ahmedabad that you said, at that point of time, and even today, Ahmedabad is always a positive municipality. So therefore, they could raise that bond. I think after that, Nagpur also tried. Nagpur also did it. So wherever municipalities are a bit more streamlined in their processes and better in collecting their revenues, I think they can issue their bonds. And water is a sector which we are looking very intensely as the new sector where investments can be put in, and municipalities is one of them. As Wang said, that It will be better if we look at the greenfield smart cities that we are looking at, where the processes will be in place, the smartness will be built in, and the collections will be built in. So municipalities are expected to be more financially robust than the existing ones.
Can you hear me? All right, okay. I think it's also an interesting experiment for us to bring companies together for a common cause, because we know that companies compete in the same space, and for us to bring them together for this. So we have had several rounds of conversation with, say, the top 20 Indian companies. The interesting learning for us in terms of designing a program, of course, there are clear areas, if you will. Water, for example, is a big need for different companies in terms of investing, CSR funds, energy to some extent. So one thing that we were advised by companies is don't try and build specific projects, because they focus a lot on geographies where their plants are. So try and design a program where people can just fit their interest in different geographies. So to give you an example, rooftop solar, for example. So if you design it in a programmatic mode, and say Mahindra has its plants in Jamnagar, they can invest their money in that area only. Some other company has it in some other geography. So design these programmatic approaches. That was one sort of clear advice that came from companies. And you can think about these programmatic approaches in different areas. Watershed is also kind of, if you look at the NABARD watershed development programs, it's a very plug and play kind of a model. You know, they have these typical 1 hectare treatment cost. You can do it in any identified area. Any company can go in any sort of geographical area and pay this additional money and say we want this done in this treatment area. So for us now, the challenge is go back to the drawing board and design 2 or 3 programs that are sort of geographically neutral in that sense, but yet attractive to companies. And the second sort of takeaway for us from these conversations was keeping in mind how companies can leverage this in terms of the PR. So Mahindra is a good example. They're also on our board, for example. For them, being carbon neutral is one of their objectives. So how can you generate credits out of these programs, not to sell, but them, for them to cancel that internally and declare themselves as carbon neutral, or water neutral for that example. So I think these are the 2-3 interesting perspectives that came from the stakeholder consultations, and now we are trying to sort of develop a program that will take into consideration these company interests. Quickly on the municipal green bonds, interestingly, GIZ is now conducting a survey of 20 municipalities, and these are the ones that, so SEBI has norms for which municipalities can go for accessing market-based funds. And these are your credit rating, your last 3 years balance sheet and all that. So they have a list of criteria for accessing a market-based capital. And if you filter all of that, there are some 20 municipalities in India that are currently eligible to access market-based capital. So we looked at these 20, and now we are executing a survey to understand sort of, have they tried this in the past, what are the barriers, so on and so forth. We'll have sort of something in place by the end of this year. So hopefully that will be interesting to a lot of stakeholders here, the report. And finally, your point on premium, I think Siddharthan answered that. One thing I would say, I mean, I was in Chennai a couple of months back, and they have this new institution called Tamil Nadu Infrastructure Development Corporation. And they were talking to me about an interesting model where if you come up with any kind of climate change project, they will finance the capex. So, but they are looking for returns in terms of the operating capital. So be it energy, be it climate smart agriculture, they might provide you land for free in that case. So I think it's an interesting model where clearly private sector can't take all the risks. So they are willing to take up part of the risk in terms of capex, but then the operating expenditure has to be recovered from the cash flows. So that's one sort of example of models that might work.
Great. So maybe we can take one more round of questions and we'll collect them again and go with the panel if there are more questions. Yes.
Thank you. My question is for Kokoyo. So we have a nonprofit program that trains architects and HVAC consultants on energy efficiency in six cities in India, and we're currently looking for grant funding. So it's just kind of an open question on um, how do we go about approaching and organization like yours for grant funding.
I have a couple of questions. One thing I couldn't help but notice that when I was listening, I was feeling really nice and good. Okay, but the problem is is this only, that we have so many good stories, promising stories, but the gap is still large. That the scaling up, the adding up of all these initiatives is not happening at the pace and scale that we would want that to happen. So an open question is what do you think is in the way of that scaling up, or is it just too early in the experimentation stage, and it will eventually get scaled up? Second question is about it's a wild thought emerging from the example that Koel gave on the CSR initiative. Now, because it's mandated by a policy, it can be treated as, you know, a proxy public money. They have to spend that money on certain types of project with some flexibility. Now, it's a wild thought in the sense that whatever little money that is there in the form of CSR, can that be used for leveraging the private investments, maybe from the same companies, right? And in support with other financial institutions. That's just an wild thought. Third is, and I'm taking clue from the experience that Philippines has, it has a mechanism of a regular meeting of all the donors together to coordinate their programs. I don't know about the others, but there are 4 different agencies which work with money in India. Has the thought of coordinating among yourselves has ever occurred to you, or what do you think are the possibilities of that, and whether that would help in scaling up your own efforts? Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll go with the round of points back from the panelists now. Siddharth.
Manish, you kept the best for the last, right? You fired the salvo. I think all 3 are great questions, and I attempt to maybe 1 or 2, not all. India had a donor coordination coordinated by UN, if I'm right. It's called UNDAC, United Nations Development Assistance Coordination 17th, right? Because I used to attend when I was Norwegian NORAD before DFID. I attended some of the coordination. So it is absolutely important as we go along. The question Annapurna asked to Koel was essentially springing from the fact that TERI is doing something exactly similar, or maybe something akin to what GIC is trying to do, and how that can be coordinated I can't deny the absolute need of coordination. It's going to be more critical so that we don't duplicate. If it lead to scaling up, great, right? That's a link to the question. You duplicate well enough with a conscious attempt to scale up the success, then fine. But essentially, if you undercut, if you work cross-purpose, then both investment are going to go down, then the coordination will serve the other way of protecting investment, right? So coordination either way is important. Coordinate so that you scale up, coordinate to ensure you don't cut across each other. And I can only emphasize the need One thing, particularly from the perspective of Global Green Growth Institute, as I said, we are more like GIC went through a change. People still see GIC as a donor agency. They are like technical support agency. So we do. And I worked with the DFID, large money, multi-million, things are changing. There is a part of money exists somewhere. The whole idea of the discussion is there is a set of player who act as a bridge between where the money exists and what need to be done to get the money. So that coordination bit, fortunately, there is no cross purpose. I also helped develop project proposal, so would be JIC, it's very good. But I have no solution except for emphasize the need to coordination so that our efforts become more and lead to scale up. On the scaling part, look at the irony we have. Some of the funds we have, domestic, forget about international ones. We know the big Campa fund, right, which is massive. It's in billions now. Then even the clean environment says what we started as charging in the coal, today is $8 billion they have. Just imagine the resources to scale up what the government itself has done quite successfully. That could have been massive. So the scaling up now need to happen on multiple levels, not simply saying an excuse that there is no money. The money exists, but need to be invested into scaling up. That everyone has a role. Now, as I said, in the climate change, if you are in the climate business, particularly if you want a solution to both adaptation and mitigation, there are successful lessons. That's where we talked about knowledge sharing. That's one idea, is to how to scale within the country and outside the country. We made a conscious effort of setting a platform like Global Green Growth Knowledge Platform with the World Bank, OECD and UNEP. We also have Green Growth Best Practices one. We have internal knowledge program. As a country rep, I have the mandate to generate knowledge share with other member countries, all to scale up what is being done successfully within and outside. But again, I can't agree more with you what you said. We need to do more on that. Thanks.
I think I probably just respond to the question about scaling up. I try to find some intelligent answer because it's $1 million question or $1 billion question. It's not that you can get straightforward how to do it. I can just put forward some generic answer to get by. But just to be, as I think about, because this question has been raised everywhere, scaling up. I sometimes, just to be very, very frank, just say I can find a generic answer to your question, but I sound probably, we are here just on ourselves. I'm happy to share some frank thoughts. So I think there are different shades of the problems and issues. I give you, just to explain that, I give you a practical example. You'll say using coal, right, and also financing coal. We also have seen how over time that investment is declining. In the US, it's really, but just keep in mind, in the US, the investment in coal declining.
We implement bilateral cooperation projects between the German government and the Indian government. We have sort of three modes of funding, so to speak. We hire consultants or contractors to do a lot of our program implementation work. And these are, the terms of references and bids are open and applicable to whoever is eligible for these TORs and the RFPs. So that's one scope for you. You mentioned specifically grant funding. Grant funding is a model or vehicle we have, although it's a very small sort of amount for us. And these depend really on project to project. If they want to give grant funding, it's totally up to us. And the case has to be very strong for grant funding. Since you are into energy efficiency, our energy program is different. I can also provide you the contacts after the program. I would encourage you to talk to our energy program and see if they are willing to give grant funding to you for your work. And the last is financial cooperation. An example would be the NABARD example I gave. That's financial cooperation. So typically three modes. Quickly on Manisha's question, I think enough has been said. Just one example I'll give on the scaling up thing, and Shuman said shades of gray. I think there are shades of gray in this climate change. So recently we organized a workshop on insurance in agriculture, because we've been talking about droughts and the vagaries of monsoon. Of course, insurance has been tried and tested in India for the longest time, and there are different kinds of experience we have. One of the major risks, of course, as you would know, is basis risk, the difference between your sort of actual loss and estimated loss. So there was an interesting sort of model presented by Dhan Foundation. They have come up with this insurance product in 2 districts of Tamil Nadu for 2 specific cash crops, groundnut and cashew nut. And they have done extensive ground research looking into all the sort of lacunas that there are in existing insurance products, and finally they have been able to find out an insurance product that works. Immediately the question from everyone was, how do you scale this up? Now, of course, it's not possible to scale it up. It's a very localized model that's based on 2 particular crops. If you expand to rice, it's a whole different story you're talking about. So the point is, I think this whole question of scaling up, we shouldn't ask in every context also. And some of these things we really have to find out other ways of, maybe scaling out these concepts. I don't know what the right word is. I know we are full of terms. But the point is, maybe some of these models are not scalable. Maybe you have to, the complexity of the problem is such that you really have to go take into consideration local context and some of these nuances. And there are local solutions that work that can't be scaled up to sort of grand scales that we're talking about or thinking about. But there are, these are different contexts. Renewable energy, for example, is something that might be, opportune to scale, scales and economies of scale. So that's sort of one insight I thought I would share.
Brings us to the close of this session. It's been a great session, I think, at least demystifying some things, giving a lot of excellent examples, telling us a lot of ways in which things have worked, and some directions in terms of where we want to go, which might not work, etc. So I think the mystery remains, but it's been great learning as well. So let me just thank all the panelists profusely from my side as well as everybody in the audience, and let's put our hands together for them.